everybody. Welcome to the Mud and Rib Podcast. We are with you today from our living room. We are going to be talking about can't afford to fight, marriage and money today. This is a subject that was really not fun for us when we first got married. And so we're going to talk a little bit about just our experience and some of the things that you might have questions about. We're going to kind of do this more like a Q&A today. So
yes, finances can be such a source of conflict and disharmony and rob us of our oneness in marriage. But we're also going to talk about how important it is to be a good steward even before you are married, and being a good steward as a follower of Christ is so important. So we are in a relationship with Christ. First and foremost, when we choose to follow him, he calls us to a level of stewardship that reflects him, his relationship with the Father, and our relationship with him.
I think the more I've read the scriptures, the more I realize I don't really own anything, that everything is God's. And when I realize that everything that I have is God's, it's helped me to understand the stewardship principle.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's the meaning of it, is that when we talk about being a good steward and stewardship, it means that God owns it all, and I have a responsibility to take care of it, to be responsible for it, to steward what he has given me. Mm-hmm. And that's very important responsibility that I should take on as a follower of Christ. And we love to say over and over again that responsibility is like fertilizer. It
is manure.
Or no, it helps people grow.
Oh yeah, it helps people grow. It is manure.
It is manure.
And it helps people grow. Yes. Is there anything more you want to share kind of about the biblical principle of finances other than stewardship?
Yeah, sure. I think it's Matthew 6:21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be. So there's an indicator of our spiritual condition in our heart before God and other people is directly related to how we handle our money, which to me is crazy. But at the same time, after years of walking with God and learning how to steward not only people, but our resources, and it even says that how, if you can't handle the world's manna, money, then how is God going to trust us with real riches, which is people? Mm-hmm. And so our money matters to God. Money should matter to us, and money matters is very important principle and things that we should learn. All the things that involve our resources and how we handle them are this stewardship piece that we should be working on, learning, and walking in maturity in.
So when we first got married, we've said this on another podcast, I brought all the debt and you brought a couple really awesome.
I had a dog, some books,
dog, blankets.
And I did bring a little Toyota pickup truck.
You did, but you didn't have any debt. And I had a lot of debt. I mean, if you had any, it was not relevant compared to my debt. And so I came into this relationship not really having a very good understanding of finances. I just thought it was something that I earned and I spent. And so I had no real concept just of money in general, much less biblically, like what does it mean as a follower of Christ to steward resources? And so maybe let's talk a little bit about like what our first year was like. We really didn't have many resources. And a lot of that is because it was a variety of things. And we didn't have very much money at that time. And so it was really challenging for me because at that time, Guy was working more outside of our home. I was home more. And I was the one paying the bills. And I say paying the bills loosely because we didn't have resources to pay the bills. And so I would just cry every month because I didn't know what to do with this empty checkbook. That we had checks back then, by the way. There was no automatic billing and things like that. But I didn't know what to do with this because we didn't have money. And so that was a real challenge for me. One, to begin to see my lack of trust in God, that he was going to provide, or even asking him to provide. And then also just the fact that you wanted us to give generously to the work of God when we didn't have money to pay our electric bill.
So I was fortunate to have some elders, some more mature believers who were teaching me about this stewardship piece. And they were helping me understand that before we got married. But it's also important to know that when we got married, I had a clear understanding that we were going to have to deal with some debt. It wasn't like it was a surprise. We had talked about some of that and then how we were going to have to trust God to work through all of this. But I think it became a pretty hardcore shock to you at the way I challenged us to steward our finances.
Yes. So let me just some examples of that in our first couple of years, honestly, is, we made a commitment that we weren't going to spend any money on clothes or really on anything until we paid off our debt. We each had $10 a month back then that we could spend to go to the movies or whatever. And you could actually go to a movie for $10 because there was a dollar movie theater. But that was about all we had. And we didn't give gifts for birthdays. We didn't take our kids to the doctor unless someone else paid for it. We didn't have groceries a lot of times. And God just provided groceries to our doorstep. And so we'll talk more about that, but that's just kind of where we were. We didn't really have much to steward, but what we had, we were going to, as we said, and you said, you can't outgive God, and we're going to tithe or give our way through this debt that we're going to be paying off.
Yeah, so I'd read stories like George Mueller, and George Mueller ran incredible orphanages by faith that basically almost like castles that he used for orphanages in England, and the incredible stories of God providing. I read lots of missionary biographies about trusting God in the field. And so for me, I felt like that it was important for us to trust God and give through this, give through the debt. We did not believe that 10% was a law. I just felt like it was a floor of trust that we needed to take that principle that goes all the way back to Abraham and Melchizedek, and we were going to trust God with that 10% principle because it was a demonstration of trust to him, that we were going to trust him to help us through some of our poor decisions that we had made prior to coming to Christ. Kelli didn't know before she came to Christ about stewardship because she didn't have a relationship with God. And so stewardship is about relationship, and we have to start with where we are. And there's some key principles in stewardship. A lot of times we are in a place where we don't think we have money, and part of it is because we don't know how to manage it very well. And we spend money like crazy. Now, we didn't have enough to cover the basic budget that we had, and so we needed to lock down on any type of excessive spending or any type of debt at all, and start working towards paying that off and live within our means, within our budget. One of the biggest problems we have is that we don't live within our means, and our wants far exceed our needs. And we just buy and buy and buy and use credit cards, which we did not use because we did not have the money, nor did we want to get into the interest that was there. We were paying off credit cards, but we cut them up and never used them for a long, long time.
Right. That's really good. So maybe we can talk about this. What would you say the importance of getting out of debt, staying out of debt? Let's talk about kind of the freedom that brings and kind of our journey with that.
Sure. So like I said, one of it started with, this could have been a huge issue with us, but to Kelli's credit, she trusted me and trusted the leadership that we were working with, those who were discipling us on how to walk through this. And so I said, we're going to trust God, we're going to give through, and we're going to watch him provide. And I said, I can live without power, but I cannot live without the power of God and a demonstration that I trust him in everything I do. And this might seem crazy to you or crazy to some, but this is how God's upside down kingdom works. Are we going to trust him and obey him no matter what? Are we going to trust in ourselves? Do we trust a God whose story is, I will provide? And so Abraham and Sarah, I'm going to provide you a child. And then they demonstrated that they did not trust in the promise of the story. And she gave him a mistress, Hagar, and all the mess that came as a result of that.
Right.
is once again an example of how we don't trust the story and we start working all kinds of side hustle and side game instead of trusting God and obeying him. So we committed to do that. And I led the way in that. This is one of the few areas in our life where I said, we must do this. And Kelli followed. But this began our oneness of trust together in Christ, the kingdom, and the kingdom principles.
And thankfully, there were people around us that saw our commitment to this. And because of that, God used our community to help us, help meet basic needs so that we could pay off debt. Some people helped us with some of our debt. I used to go to the mailbox every day praying, God, please send money so that we could pay off this debt quickly. And that never happened. But I always say, thank God it didn't, because I think it really helped build into me that I never wanted to be in debt like that again, because it was a prison in a lot of ways, because there would be needs around us that people had, and we wanted to be generous, but beyond what we were already giving, we couldn't be generous beyond that, because we were not free from our debt. I'm saying this because it's important that we are in community and that we work through these things in a community, because one, we can be accountable for things. People can help support us in that in various ways. And when you're faithful in that and people see that you're faithful in doing what you say you're going to do, people are more inclined to want to help you. And so thank God for the people in our life that were willing to do that. One of the questions that has been brought up is debt a sin? And so, in this culture, it's really hard to not have a mortgage. It's hard for many to not have a car note. Now, I think there are a lot of things we can do radically to eliminate a lot of that. But what is your thoughts about it being a sin to be in debt?
Well, the scripture says, owe no man nothing except the debt of love. But it doesn't say clearly that debt is a sin. It's enslaved to stuff certainly can be sinful. So I do think we need to evaluate what got me here. And usually sinful, selfish decisions get us in that place. But I don't want people walking around in condemnation. If you're in debt, what I want you to do is walk around in the freedom and power of Christ to get yourself out of it and to not be controlled by anything other than Christ and his spirit. So I believe wholeheartedly in the principle of financial freedom. And we need to be free to go wherever God says we need to go to obey him. And debt does keep us from being free. There's no doubt about it.
That's right. So you kind of already touched on this about tithing versus sacrificial giving. What would you say to people who are listening about where they should start when it comes to giving to the kingdom if they're in debt?
So for me, my own personal conviction is like I said, we were going to give 10%, not because it was a ceiling, but because it was a floor of trust for me. I see that principle throughout scripture. Before even the law, Abraham gave 10% to Melchizedek. And so for us, it's just a principle of 10%. That's what the word tithe means. And of course, in the Old Testament, the percentage of giving is somewhere 23, almost a 30% of when you take in all the offerings. But for me, it was just a demonstration of trust. And I think that we need to evaluate where we are and what is it going to look like for me to trust God to get through this process. And so for me, I was going to give 10%, whether I was in debt or not. And then I was going to be disciplined, and we were going to be disciplined to begin to pay our debt off.
How do couples need to start this journey around finances? And I'm going to kind of answer what I think. The first thing is that it goes back to our original podcast about side-by-side leadership,
right,
and about being on the same page together. I know that it is really important that as a couple, and I recommend that if you're dating to marry, that you pretty early on start talking about what each other's view is about finances. And there's a lot of questions that you can look at about if we're going to have kids, does the wife desire to stay home? How do we think we want to spend on kids, vacations? What about giving? All those things are questions that you need to ask yourself. And those same questions need to be talked about as a married couple is how do we see finances, and do we see finances for our family?
So one of the most difficult pieces, we talked about communicating through conflict, having crucial conversations. And one of those difficult and crucial conversations that we need to have is around the area of finances. So the two are now becoming one. Mm-hmm. So how do we unite around our finances? And I know one of the things that we need to talk about is, how do we handle the budget? And we believed as one, we shared one bank account. We began to attack everything out of oneness. And then you get into the fact of what happens when you have a situation where one spouse is committed and even more disciplined and the other is not. This gets hairy and complicated if you don't have action and behavior that moves towards the oneness of how we're going to steward our money and get out of debt. And sometimes you'll have a spender and sometimes you'll have a saver, and that creates all kinds of issues. But we even know some couples that could not enter oneness in this area, that they ended up having two separate bank accounts and dividing who pays the bills and who doesn't. And it's usually because one member of the marriage does not have the character, the discipline, or the proper behavior to move forward towards oneness with their money. And it reveals to me some real character issues.
So I want to speak to this whole one bank account versus two. I think what we want to talk about is what is ideal. And then there are examples like what Guy has shared that was important to do outside of ideal in order to maintain oneness in their marriage. And I think there are times that's appropriate, but I want to be clear and say it's not ideal. And so one of the reasons why I think that this whole one bank account thing is so important is because if you don't want to have a joint bank account, my question is why? Why do you not want to have a joint bank account? Do you have something that you want to hide? Is it I want to be in control of what I spend? I know when we first got married, I had a pretty decent job. I just managed to spend all the money that I made, but I had a good job and I struggled with feeling like all the money's in one bank account. I can't spend anything. I have no control over it. And I honestly didn't want to give up control of the money that I had been making. And so that was a challenge for me. And so that was where I had to die to myself and choose to grow into maturity around that. And so that would be a question for me if I were in the place of not wanting to have a joint bank account with my spouse, is why do I not want a joint bank account? Because is there something that I want to hide? Are my spending habits not good and I'm embarrassed by it? What is the reason that you don't want to have? Do you not trust your spouse? Yeah. And so that could also, maybe there's some valid reasons you don't trust them and you need to have some hard conversations. I think it as much as humanly possible, we need to work toward being able to have a joint bank account, because there is a sense of oneness and togetherness in that keeps us walking in the way that we should when we're not keeping things separate from each other. It's no different than our phones. We shouldn't have phones that have passwords on it that our spouses can't see. We need to be accountable in this area. So there's ideal, and then there are times that you have to do things differently in order to maintain your marriage. But I think ideal, you need to have a joint bank account.
Yeah, it's kind of like do all that you can to live peaceably with all people, but you can't always do that. So you need to do what you can to move forward in your relationship to the best of your ability. If there's no way, if you're at a place where it's like we cannot come to any type of resolution, then there are some things at times where you're just going to have to do the thing that's not ideal in order to keep moving forward and salvage the relationship. Mm-hmm. So there's always this idea of wanting to live out the ideal and want to be right rather than what is redemptive. And so we always need to move towards what is redemptive, but the ideal is super important in this process. But sometimes you just can't get there because of where you are or where your spouse is in the process. And so one of the things that I would ask, and if you have other questions, is, well, where did we start? How did we start moving towards the ideal?
I mean, we had a joint bank account right away, But as far as debt and all those things, it was a long process. I mean, I think we started by, what is it that we believe the goal is with our money? We had to start there. There had to be a common denominator around, what does God say about stewardship, money, and what do we believe our response should be to that? That was the first thing.
Yeah. So, but also with that, we need to figure out a budget. How much are we bringing in? How much goes out? And then how are we going to tackle the debt and begin to move forward?
Yeah. So for us, it was, in our case, especially early on with the debt that we had, everything that came in, we paid our basic bills and everything else went to debt. We allowed ourselves, like I said before, $10 a month each to spend. And again, that $10 would be more like $40 probably a month. It wasn't much, but it was enough to do something. And the way we did it is that we did cash everything back then in order to really maintain discipline and control over our finances. But it was also good for me that if I had $10 and I wanted to go and do something with it, that I could spend it at my own, for whatever I wanted, and you could do the same. And so that, for us, that worked. That doesn't work for everybody. And that increased over time, where each of us kind of had a spending budget. And one of the things that we did, and some people kind of laugh at us for doing this, but when our budget got to be maybe $100 each a month, and we were going to go out to eat dinner, and even once we had kids, we would have a conversation about, do you have allowance for us to go to eat? Well, no, I don't have enough this time. And I have to say, am I willing to cover the family out of my allowance for us to go and eat out? Or if we were at a restaurant and we both agreed we could both contribute, Guy would pay half and I would pay half out of my allowance. Sometimes he'd pay more, I'd pay more. It just depended on how we had spent our money that month, but we would agree before we would go out to eat. We didn't go to restaurants where you had to tip, because we wanted to make sure that we could enjoy eating out, but be good stewards of the resources we had.
Let me just say, that is not an ideal system for most couples, because usually that's just asking for conflict.
It is.
So I would almost say, when you give 50% has to go towards entertainment together, and 50% of it goes towards whatever you want to spend it on. But for us, it really worked. And honestly, part of it is because I would play golf every once in a while, but I made sure that there was time for Kelly's and my date night and time to take the kids out, and I really didn't care. So I would more than willing give the money for time with my wife and a time with my wife and kids. So as a result of that, there wasn't that much conflict. There really wasn't any out of that. And Kelly was kind of the same way. So we just didn't hold on to that very tightly. Most couples can't do that. I'm not saying we're above everybody, but for some reason for us, that worked. And I'm not saying that that's a good system for everybody. I think it'd be better for you to say, this is how much we're going to give for family entertainment. This is for date night. And then this is for your own personal spending. If you were to ask me, how would you coach me to budget this out?
I agree, because most couples we've talked to, when we've shared this example, they just say that wouldn't work for us. And that's totally fine. That's just what worked for us at that time. But the point of it is making sure that you've agreed, outside of your regular bills, how much are you going to save? How much is going to be spent on, entertainment? How much is going to be eating out? How much is going to be clothes, Christmas? Are we going to buy Christmas decorations? Are we going to buy Thanksgiving decorations? Are we going to host people in our home? All those things have to be thought about. And you, like we say in all of our podcasts, you have to figure out what works for you as a family and as a couple. It's going to look different for everybody. These are just ideas and ways that we did it.
Yes. And, this takes some guts, and it takes some commitment. Live within your means. This is the biggest part. Sometimes we have a champagne taste on a beer budget. We think we have to have all this nice stuff, and we really can't afford it. And we're trying to keep up with the Joneses. Now, there's also an incredible amount of cultural pressure. And I understand that, but I refuse to bow down to any culture, my culture or anyone else, unless it's to impact it for God's kingdom. So I led us to do some crazy stuff. I said, we're not going to give presents for that. We can't afford to give presents for that. I'm communicating to my family, we don't have the money for that. And that is that. And that's how we're going to do until we can trust God through this situation. And there's a key principle in this, is that there's times like this when you're walking through debt or difficulty that you're spending time in the desert. And this desert experience is, are you going to trust God, take responsibility for your stuff, and believe that he is good and trust him through it and know that there's a promised land coming? Or are you going to just continue to act like you're in a place of promise with milk and honey when truly you're in a desert? And so the idea is, do I trust God in the midst of the desert? And our time was a desert when you came to. It was. We were just, it was so painful during those 5 or 6 years that I'll never forget when we got totally debt free. I took my family out to Chili's and wept. I mean, we did not go to Chili's. If we were going to go anywhere, you were going to have to pay for us. That's just the way that it was. And imagine being a young couple in a church with a bunch of young people
that were affluent,
and us saying, I'm sorry, we can't go because we don't have money. That is the type of resolve we need in order to follow Jesus.
Yeah, I think and so much of, and women talk about this a lot on social media, Pinterest, things like that, is that there is such pressure for our homes to be a place that looks like a museum and not a place where people live, and that we need to normalize simple, small, things where, instead of glamorizing everything that's big and perfect. And so there is a lot of pressure. And I appreciate very much the guy had the resolve to say, we're not going to do those things. On my own, I know I couldn't have done it, but because he led the way in that, it gave me a lot of boldness to be able to do that. And I was with women in a women's group that just loved on me and cared for me and seemed to never tire of the fact that we didn't have the resources. And they celebrated with us when we got out of debt.
Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, it was an amazing experience. And as a result of that, think about this. Interestingly enough, right at the moment, about the same time that we got debt free, is about the time that God spoke and said, it's time for y'all to go and start and plant your own church. And that church sent us out because they saw us demonstrate faithfulness in the gospel, faithfulness in disciple making, and faithfulness in our finances. And we were at free enough place to be able to go and plant because we were not encumbered. We were not burdened down with debt. And again, I cannot mention enough that this was in a very affluent area that we walked through this with. So there could have been a ton of shame and a ton of stuff that kept us from obeying as a result of being around that type of affluence.
Yeah, one thing I want to just add, and then we'll move on to our next question, is that we really practice, if we needed something, asking our community first. Does anybody have this that we could buy at garage sale prices, or would be able to help us with this? And I think so often in our culture, it's so easy just to jump on Amazon and buy something and not give any thought to the fact that someone might actually have that sitting around and they don't need it anymore. And I could use that at a discounted price or for nothing and don't have to spend the money. We almost pride ourselves on being able to spend the money on everything. And we don't allow ourselves to live in community very well and help share resources. And that's biblical. In Acts, that's what they did. They shared what they had with other people. And so we've just gotten so far away from that I think that's something that we could do better at.
Yeah, during that time, almost every piece of furniture, everything hanging around us had a story of faith connected to it. And even the stuff we have now is a story of faith, of how us being faithful with our resources put us in a place of prosperity that we never imagined that we could have in our lives. Now we're back to living by faith because we don't live by our financial resources or how big our paychecks are. We live by faith. And so we find ourselves back in a place of living by faith and trusting God month to month to provide, because this is a place where he's led us back to. But there was an incredible season of really affluence in our own lives as a result of our faithfulness and living within our means.
Yes. So one of the questions that comes up a lot is, what do I do if one spouse makes more than the other, or if someone in the family stays home with kids? There's a lot of, and I think I even felt this way a little bit in the beginning, but I think there's a lot of pressure or feeling like I stay home with the kids, he makes all the money, so therefore I don't have any say in how we spend the money. It's his money. So I guess the question is, are we one in our finances or are we not? And so I just would like to kind of unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you answered it. It's like, we've viewed everything as this is us as a team. This is our money, even though I teased her and said, well, whenever we got married, we said, what is yours is mine and what's mine is mine. So,
but he never acted like that.
No, we work together as a team, and God is our provider. So really nowhere in scripture does it say that the man is supposed to be the provider. God is supposed to be our provider, and he should lead in trusting that provision. And so for me, just like with Jesus, I'll remind you in Luke 8, it was the women, there was key women that provided for Jesus's ministry in Luke 8 and the ministry of the disciples. Women were the ones that provided because God is the provider. We trust God. So, there's going to be seasons where maybe your wife makes more money and maybe you make more money, but the question is, whose money is it? It's God, and he is our provider. Therefore, we trust him together. And so we are a team that works together. We are, again, in oneness. We are one, and we're going to operate that way. And we need to have conversations and communication that continues to move us in that direction.
And I think that just goes with, many wives will stay home with kids. And I think to devalue that as not being a job, so to speak, when you think about what you would have to pay to put your kids in daycare, what you would have to pay for your wife to go to work and clothe herself and take, eat out and all the things that are required to go to a job, you have to look at that as something, as part of a contribution to the family, equally as a spouse, regardless of what the financial income is. And so I think it's just so important that we value our kids being an investment that is worth it when it comes to our finances.
Yeah, to put anything above our relationship with our wife and kids, to me, is a disaster waiting to happen. And so there's nothing more important than creating a healthy environment for our family, and whatever sacrifices we need to make need to be made in order to have a healthy, Christ-centered home.
And one of the things we did is, like Guy said, there's been times he worked and I was home with the kids. There was a season where I was working and you were home with the kids doing some part-time stuff. And so we've just always done whatever it takes, made the sacrifices. And I will say Guy led the way with that. But we did it together. And so I'm super grateful for that. One of the other questions that has been brought up is, do we have financial secrets from each other, such as financial infidelity, like hiding purchases, hidden debt? And it's about 28% of spouses admit hiding debt or big buys. And that also goes into the question of, should either of us ever spend without telling the other? And so if so, what are the kind of the guidelines around that?
Yeah, I don't. To me, that is just evidence that if you're hiding stuff in secret and bringing stuff into the darkness and not bringing it into the light, you've not experienced transforming freedom, and nor can you engage in oneness. That's a huge issue, hiding anything. And so that to me is just a recipe for disaster in your relationship if you're hiding financial stuff. And it also, to me, shows an area of immaturity in your stewardship.
It just breaks trust. When I think about all of this is based on trust. We're trusting God. We're developing trust with one another. And you go and do things like that, and the trust bank is going to start to deplete. It's going to get less and less where your spouse trusts you. And so it's really important that we continue in trust with God, trust with each other, in our finances.
I understand making mistakes, but we've got to move to a place to where we start moving towards transparency and accountability.
Well, and I know someone that found out that her spouse had a credit card that she knew nothing about, and he was spending money on that. And so that's an example of hiding,
Yeah, and it's a dangerous one. I'm sorry, with the rampant world of pornography these days with men, you've got no business having that private stuff like that. I just feel like that that's opening yourself up to bondage and a dangerous place. Sin is crouching at your door. Will you trust God to overcome it?
So for us specifically around, do we spend money without telling the other? We've had different kind of principles for our family at different seasons. But when we really just kind of started coming into having a little bit of money after paying off our debt, I think we had a goal of, we wouldn't make purchases over $50 without the other person. That increased to $100 at some point. But even still, even when we had more money, we really just didn't go make purchases that were more than $100 without really talking to each other if it was outside of groceries and normal expenditures, just because, I don't know, out of respect, I felt like I owed a conversation, not to get permission, but just to say, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was $150 an allowance that we had at the time for each of us, and we may have increased it a little bit. Within that, when that was given to you to spend on whatever you wanted, but if it got outside of that, that's a problem.
Well, yeah, we even outside of our allowance had if we need something like a vacuum cleaner and it's $50, no big deal. But anything over that or over $100, we would have a conversation. So I think it's just about mutual respect and talking about things and making sure that the two of you are on the same page about any kind of spending limits. And then maybe let's talk, just as we kind of finish up, about how often do we talk about finances? Like a rhythm, what do we talk about in our situation?
Well, in the early days when we weren't very good stewards of it, there was a lot of conversations. Almost weekly we were talking about it. And
I was crying.
Yeah,
I was crying
and praying and begging for provision. And because we're back in a place where we're trusting God for monthly support for our ministry and what we're doing, that we have a lot more regular rhythm. Again, it's almost weekly about where we are, how we're doing, and what do we need to do to respond to whatever God's saying and whatever he's leading us to do. Is, I think, a weekly rhythm is pretty important. Now, maybe when you're in a place where you're a lot better off, it doesn't have to be as regular as that. But I think we always need to be discussing as we're going kind of stuff. Do you have to have a formal meeting? Well, not always. It's kind of like what we talk about in discipleship. It's a formal time is super helpful to make sure your ducks are in a row and to make sure that you've got a helpful, intentional system, but it ought to be as you're going. So there ought to be some as you're going communication about things like you're talking about. Well, hey, I'm thinking about, we need this. Can I get this particular thing? Yes. Then you need to have that conversation as you're going, but it doesn't hurt to have a regular rhythm. And I would say you need to, of making sure that we are together with our finances.
And just some practical things that we even do is that Guy handles most of the bill paying. We laugh because it's like all on automation.
Like it used to be.
But I don't look at the bank account all the time like he does. I have full access to that. But a lot of times we'll sit and talk about if we have any money in our retirement. Do we have any money in a savings? How much is there? How much do we have in our checking account? Where are we? One of the things I want to say about a long-term goal should be making your money work for you, getting in a place where you have financial freedom. And for us in the beginning, we would not use credit cards at all. But now we use our credit cards and we put everything on our credit card and we pay it in full every month. It doesn't matter if it's $2,000 or $5,000 or more. We pay it in full. But the reason why we do that is, at one time when interest rates were so low and we were not getting any return on our money in the bank, we were getting more money in points on our credit card by doing that than we were money in the bank.
In the savings account.
In the savings account. So the point of that is that, man, when you get free from debt and the bondage of that, and you really begin to steward and manage your money well, you can do things like put money in a CD to help it earn some interest. You can do some things with the stock market. You can do some things like that and be more trustworthy with paying everything with a credit card and paying it off every month. But the starting point is having conversation. Are we on the same page about our finances? What do we believe about what God says about money? What do we believe about finances and our oneness? What do we say are going to be the ways that we're going to spend money outside of our bills? How are we going to handle managing that money? All of those things need to be a conversation, and working toward ultimately being debt-free and making your money work for you. The most important thing in all of this, though, is taking radical steps And I will say that one of the most radical ones is being generous. We need to be generous with our money. We are not a bank. We can't take it with us. And we certainly need to save and be good stewards, but we need to be generous with our money. That is what God wants. And he wants us to be free to be able to do, move, go, give, whatever it might be at any time with the resources that we have.
Yeah, that's good. And I would say, man, we support the work of the gospel and discipleship and church planting, moving forward. The mission of God is essential, and it does take resources, even things like starting businesses to help sustaining work in unreached people groups is so important. Even here in North America, helping support those who are doing work not only locally, but globally, that are, seeing the gospel go forth and making disciples that make disciples. And of course, meeting the needs of those that are around us, that are the last, the least, and the lost. And it's the compassion of Christ that helps us fulfill the great commission of Christ. And so we need to be giving our resources towards that. Some have said that Americans give more money for costumes for our pets
for
Halloween than they do for the work of the gospel going to the ends of the earth. That is not good.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, we just want to say thank you for being with us. Truthfully, just as an example, our podcast happens because of donors like you. There are people that see what God is doing and they support the work. And because of that, we are able to do what we do. And so thank you for those of you that have been generous to do that. But most importantly, we want the people in our audience to be giving where God is at work and where God is doing things and to the needs of people around you. And so our prayer for you is that you will grow in maturity around your finances, around oneness in your marriage when it comes to finances, and that you will be able to have a healthy relationship because of it.
Yes. The kingdom of God is not going to go forward if we don't raise up mature, healthy stewards who are going to steward the work of starting, strengthening, and sustaining disciples, churches, and leaders. And that involves our finances as well as every aspect of our lives. So, man, will you be a good steward? Where your treasure is, there your heart will be. How are you handling your treasure? And then how are you handling your relationships? And asking Jesus, please help me be the kind of man or woman that you want me to be, the kind of steward that's faithful with a little so that we can be faithful with much.
Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next time.
God bless.